turn it on, do you prefer it without the mic or with the mic? This is without the mic.
Without.
Is that fine? Here you go, let's just hear it with so we can Phil Down into it. Oh, listen to that. I like the voice of God. I think the mic off is better. Cool. So let me begin by taking a moment to thank Dr. Lane, the members of the Department of English, Philosophy, and Religious Studies, and the students of Georgia Southern University for all their hard work organizing this conference, bringing us all together to reflect on the theme of social responsibility. I hope you'll join me for a moment in thanking them for all of their hard work. Really, it's totally impressive that they've been able to pull this together. Hang on, let me get my stuff here. All right. It's really impressive that they've been able to pull this together. I mean, I think it's a wonderful opportunity to bring young scholars from across the country, from as far as New England to as far south as Florida and further afield to really discuss this topic, which I do think is very important and essential to moving forward both socially and philosophically. The subtitle of my talk is 3 Reflections on the Relation Between Self and Society. But it could have easily been entitled 3 Reflections on the Relation Between the Public and the Private, the Individual and the Collective, or the Personal and the Communal, because it concerns itself with a tension which runs between these channels. You see, my work began by recognizing a problem which lies in navigating these tensions, a problem all too apparent in the history of philosophy. Namely, the temptation to absolutize one side of this dialectic to the possible obliteration of the other. Indeed, it seems to me that in many ways the history of social and political thought can be told as a series of disasters and wrong turns in the attempt to chart the appropriate relationship between these apparent poles. I say apparent because it's not necessarily clear to me that they are opposite poles or some functioning in some sort of binary dialectic. Tonight it's my goal to show 2 of the wrong turns and a possible 3rd way out of these sorts of wrong turns. In this way, I hope to share with you in a very general and a very introductory way some of the ideas which have been guiding me as I complete my newest book manuscript, which is tentatively entitled, as you heard, Sympathy for the Devil, Resisting the Tyranny of the Infinite. Now, I plan on doing this I don't assume that you necessarily know the thinkers that we're going to be discussing a bit. So I'm going to give you, in a very general introductory way, some of their thought, and I will confess ahead of time that I'm going to be doing a bit of straw manning. For 2 reasons. One, because it's my prerogative, it's fun. I mean, what's philosophy without fallacies? I mean, I love fallacious work. And second of all, because I do think sometimes reducing these people to their most core and most essential thoughts, even at the risk of missing some of the subtlety, allows you to really see the kind of hidden logic behind their work, the kind of unthought which grounds that which is thought, the unspoken which grounds the spoken in their work. You are, I have to confess, the first public audience with whom I've shared this material. So in many ways, I'm giving you a peek into the subject of what has been, up until this very moment, nothing more than the object of private reflection. As you can imagine, then, I'm more than a little nervous to give this talk. Not only because I'll be sharing with you what has, up until this very moment, been an exclusively private endeavor, but also because of the nature of the public with whom I have the honor of sharing it. A group of some of the best young philosophers from around the country. That's you, by the way, in case you weren't sure. Now, how could I not feel a little intimidated and overwhelmed giving these responsibilities? How could I not approach this moment with some apprehension, with some burden of responsibility to you, to my manuscript, and to the conference organizers? After all, Dr. Lane was very generous in having me out here. I don't want to do her the disservice of embarrassing her and making you think, who's this joker who Dr. Lane thinks, is worth speaking to us? You can see from this that your presence at this talk is more than some brute objective fact, like the presence of the chairs upon which you sit, the walls which enclose us here, or the manuscript from which I read. Your attention does not merely accompany my talk as these objects do. Your presence is not an accidental feature of my lecture. Indeed, your presence is essential, as is quite obvious, to the public nature of this conference. As a result, your attendance weighs upon me in a way that other simple attending accidental objects do not. Your gaze and the attention it conveys demands something of me. It calls for a response from me. In this regard, your presence presents me with a kind of responsibility. Yeah? Quite literally, the ability to respond to that solicitation. And I experience this solicitation as a burden to inspire you to deeper thought, to interest you, to entertain you, at the very least to not bore you, right? I know many of you are hungry. I heard grumblings outside, how long do you think this will be? Which only tempts me to go really long. Insanely long. So it is that I experience a radical difference between my private reflections on the question of responsibility and my public presentation of them. A difference I feel in this sense of trepidation, intimidation, and nervousness. What's more, this feeling appears to be indicative of something more than a merely quantitative change, as if the only difference between thinking these thoughts alone and presenting them to you is the size of the audience, as if it's grown from 1 to, I don't know, 50. As if it's just changed from self to society. There's instead a qualitative difference between the experience of my private reflections and this public presentation. Your attention functions as a kind of philosopher's stone. Well, you Harry Potter fans should know what that is. It affects some sort of invisible alchemy upon me, and my experience of myself, my very ideas and reflections, they're transformed. By your presence alone, you irrevocably transform my up until now private thoughts into a publicly traded commodity. You move them from the cloistered realm of the secret to the open realm of the civic. And in doing so, you challenge my experience of them from merely self-satisfying to socially responsible. You take them from being an object of personal delight and turn them into a source of anxiety and obligation. Thank you very much. Now, this is, of course, a feeling with which I'm sure you're all very familiar. And if not now, then certainly as this weekend's proceedings commence, and each one of you stand before your peers and present your own private work in a public forum. Right? You're welcome. Now, in calling attention to this feeling, it's my goal, first of all, to offer you some solace and solidarity. It's to say that you're not alone in your nervousness, Justina McCrae. I, too, am afraid. I, too, am challenged and intimidated by the presence of an audience and the task of sharing my words with them. But there's another reason behind my confession. Namely, to point to a phenomenon which I think lies at the heart of the question of social responsibility. A phenomenon, furthermore, which I think can guide us as we attempt in our own way to chart that relationship between self and society, private and public. And now, I am, of course, not the only one to have recognized the significance of this feeling, nor suggest its utility as a guide in exploring the question of the relation between self and society. A number of thinkers from across the history of philosophy have done likewise. You can think, for example, of Plato's reflections in the Laches. I'm sure Dr. Levinas taught you this, where Socrates suggests that something like the fear of failing in front of one's peers, what has traditionally been translated there as shame, functions to motivate the soldier to noble and responsible action. Nowhere, however, at least in my opinion, are these sorts of investigations richer than in the thought of someone like Martin Heidegger, who, following the phenomenological rallying call of Edmund Husserl to go back to things themselves, attempted to peg philosophical reflection to precisely phenomena of this kind, to precisely real-life experience, what we all feel as we stand before one another. So I'm going to take a moment to first address Heidegger. It's my first straw man. Now, Heidegger addresses the phenomena of social responsibility and the sense of intimidation it can inspire in section 2 of division 2 of his, of course, infamous tome, Being and Time. There, Heidegger describes the feeling of being called forth, summoned, and solicited, I'm literally quoting him here, by the appeal of an audience as, and this is his term for it, the call of conscience. Once more, according to him, it is a mood, you know he loves that term, or feeling, which he argues reveals, and I quote, a fundamental existential ontology of the being in question, which is, of course, our own way of being, right? What Heidegger terms enigmatically Dasein. In other words, Heidegger says this is a feeling which can tell us a little bit about the way in which we are in the world. Yeah? And it's a fundamental feeling to understanding that. And of course, you're familiar with Heidegger's ontology and phenomenology of anxiety and deep boredom and love, which he always says is included with that, but he never spends any time talking about, maybe because he had a faulty understanding of himself. We'd have to ask Arendt. But with whom he had a love affair, because he didn't know. Screwy stuff. It's interesting that he also sees this sense of nervousness and intimidation as one of these fundamental moods that can reveal to us the nature of our being. According to Heidegger, the call to consciousness reveals Dasein to be, and I quote, a concernful being in the world and a being with others. It reveals, in other words, the fact that in its own being, Dasein, that's our kind of being, is always already transcendent and ecstatic, standing, stasis, outside of, ex, beyond itself, right? Ecstatic. Or, as he puts it earlier in the text, Dasein finds itself primordially thrown into and inextricably a part of the world. Now, what's strange, however, my guess is those of you who've taken an intro to philosophy, have you read Heidegger? Are you familiar with these ideas more or less? All right, so this is pretty introductory, you see. Okay, but what's strange to me is the way that Heidegger proceeds from acknowledging this feeling, the call to consciousness, to account for its meaning. That is, how Heidegger moves from accounting for how it is that one can have this experience to what it is that it means that we do. So, according to Heidegger, the experience of this sense of intimidation before others, this conscience, serves not as a call of Dasein to acknowledge its primordial responsibility, duty, or exposure to the other. So it's not at all about social responsibility. Instead, thinks Heidegger, the call to consciousness, nervousness, functions, and I quote, to call Dasein back to itself, and away from others, away from social responsibility. Indeed, thinks Heidegger, the call to conscience functions as a kind of symptom, which reveals to Dasein the fact that it's, quote, lost itself in the publicness and idle talk of the they. That it's confused itself, in the most classic and original sense of the word, with the public and social world of others. It's fused, with others. In its fundamental exposure, thrownness into the world, thinks Heidegger, we all too easily forget the fundamental fact that we are ultimately and inevitably alone in the world. A fact which is for him painfully obvious in the inevitability of death. You are, thinks Heidegger, first and foremost your own being. And no one can share the burden of that being with you. No one, he says, can die your death for you. It's very nice, it's lovely. Yeah. Just remember that, when you're on your deathbed. Or when grandma's dying, she calls, can you come see me? No, grandma, because you're going to die alone anyway. I'm busy. You are, Heidegger thinks, first and foremost your own being. It's therefore inappropriate, he concludes, to think that you share your being with or owe your being to others. And this, he claims, is precisely what we mistakenly feel in the call to consciousness, in being nervous before one another. The false belief that we are somehow accountable to them. This state of having lost oneself in the world or confused oneself with others is what he famously terms, the they, is of course what Heidegger calls, you guys know? Inauthenticity. Basic Heidegger stuff. Inauthenticity, or I like to Latinize it, inappropriateness. A way of being in, that is against, one's own being, kath alto, that would be the Greek, of being in, not apropro, one's own, that's the Latinization. Inauthenticity is thus the result, claimed Heidegger, of having forgotten the fundamental fact that you're alone, cloistered within your own being towards death. The call to conscience, as a symptom of this inauthenticity, functions, he thus claimed, as an appeal from one's being to return to its, and I quote, ownmost potentiality for its being itself, for its being towards death. The feeling of being intimidated before others reveals that we've lost ourselves in the world, and it works thereby to invite us back to our authentic singularity. Conscience, for Heidegger, is nothing more than this call to authenticity, this call to be true to one's being. The experience of nervousness, shame, guilt, and responsibility is, and I quote, ultimately nothing more than an appeal from one's own self to return to one's own self. It is a call, quote, from afar unto afar. It reaches him who wants to be brought back to himself. Conscience summons Dasein's self away from its lostness in the they. This is Heidegger. From this we see that for Heidegger, the appropriate response to the feeling that I confess to having at the beginning of this talk is to reject it as inappropriate, and to return radically to myself. To remember that the only one to whom I truly owe a response is my own being. In other words, I must remind myself that this talk and my sense of duty to it is not really about you at all, but it's about me. It's about doing justice to my own experience, to my own ideas, and to my own manuscript. So screw you. You are nothing more than an obstacle to my own self-actualization. Your presence merely distracts me from myself and my own most being. The best thing I can do right now is to ignore you and my feeling of responsibility and attune myself to my own being and ideas. What's more, the best advice I can give to you to have towards one another as this conference proceeds is to do the same. Ignore your sense of responsibility to the social they and focus on doing justice to yourself. Yeah? It'll be a fantastic conference if we all just authentically pay attention to ourselves. Wonderful. It's intellectual masturbation. It's glorious. You don't need the other. Sorry, because that's too salacious. Of course, the problem of taking this approach to the relation of the self and society and our sense of responsibility should be immediately apparent. It leads directly to a kind of egoistic anarchy, a veritable war of all against all. And isn't it this, or something remarkably similar to it, which leads to the kind of social problems we find ourselves mired in today? Greed, the resulting economic collapse, global war, and the very other problems we hope to address at this conference. I mean, I think the economic collapse is a perfect example of this, you know, where you put your own, look, business is really about me lining my own pockets. It's not about you. Don't try to distract the issue with some sense of social responsibility, right? Does what Heidegger suggests lead directly to these kinds of problems? Problems which are ultimately the result of what I like to term a kind of fascism of the self. And I've chosen the word fascism very carefully here. I mean, we must not forget Heidegger's implication in Nazism. It seems to me that this really is present in his work. We can find the seeds of this in his work. So I think we can see these problems, right? I mean, I hope you can see these problems. Hopefully you didn't take my advice seriously there, to ignore one another. All right. Now, it's in recognition of precisely these sorts of problems in Heidegger's account of the phenomenon, which led Emmanuel Levinas, here's my other straw man, a student of both Husserl and Heidegger, to reject Heidegger's conclusions and to propose a counter-account of the experience of our intimidation before others and the subsequent responsibility we owe to society. According to Levinas, the experience of what Heidegger calls the call to conscience and what we're identifying with our fear and intimidation to subject our ideas to one another publicly functions not to call ourselves back to our aloneness in the world, but does in fact just the opposite. According to Levinas, it functions to reveal the fact that we are, quote, oriented in the inverse direction, that our being is not something which is cloistered nor self-contained, but something which is exterior to ourselves, end quote. A full phenomenological account of this experience, an experience which he terms shame, reveals, he claims, that ultimately the self, and I quote, does not have the last word, and is not alone. Instead, the self is inexorably a part of the social world for which it is responsible and to which it owes itself. Levinas' account of the phenomenon of shame begins with a deceptively simple and yet devastatingly revealing question. If we are, as Heidegger asserts, primarily alone in our being, that is, if it's true that my being is first and foremost my own and no one else's, how is it possible that the other, merely by sitting in front of me, awaiting my words, can exercise such a power over me that I immediately become self-conscious, somehow split from myself, looking back at myself from the perspective of the other, and judging myself from his or her vantage? You can see it's a very simple question, but it's profoundly provocative. How is it possible that the other is capable of inserting him or herself so powerfully and irrevocably between myself and my own being, virtually dividing me from myself such that I experience myself as if from the outside? How is it possible, in other words, that the power of the other's gaze could exceed that power by which I am bound to my own being? I mean, it would seem that the ontological bonds that tie me to myself would be stronger than the power of your look. Yeah? So if I do feel intimidated, how is it possible that I'm so easily separated from myself? Now, make no mistake. This is precisely what we're all feeling in our apprehension and our intimidation before one another. What, we think, must the other, the public be thinking of me? How do I look to him or her? How will my words be heard or understood? Will they be heard or understood? Will they be misinterpreted? What else is going on in these feelings and reflections than some sort of strange displacement of the self from the center of its own being? Some reorientation of the self to itself by way of the other. A kind of detour through the other. What the experience of shame reveals, Levinas claims, is that, in complete contrast to Heidegger's account, the self does not operate as the center of its own being. What we discover in the phenomena of shame, he claims, is the fact that the other lies at the center of our own being. That we orbit the other as a satellite drawn and defined by its pole. That we are, in other words, radically eccentric. Not merely ecstatic, but eccentric to our own being and our own experience of ourselves. We are, Levinas insists, somehow more primordially tied and accountable to the other than we are to ourselves. Not, in other words, fundamentally private beings, cloistered within the confines of our own existence, but fundamentally public and social beings, inexorably responsible to one another, inexorably responsible to the other who co-constitutes our being. So we see that in sharp contrast from Heidegger, Levinas argues that it's only by recognizing and assuming this responsibility, only by taking up the fact that the other lies at the center of my own being, that the self can fully actualize. I quote Levinas here, "To utter I is to affirm the irreducible singularity in which the apology is pursued. It means to possess a privileged place with regards to the responsibilities for which no one can replace me and from which no one can release me." This is a lovely quote here. "To be unable to shirk my responsibility to the others and to society. This is what it means to be an I." You see? My subjectivity is established in the fact that no one can respond for me. When someone asks me for help, it is only I who is responsible in that position. And that responsibility, which defines my very being, is given to me by the other, to whom I can't respond if the other has not first solicited me by a gaze, by a question, by a demand. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Really. So it is, Levinas asserts, that it is, and I quote, "only in approaching the other that the I can attend to itself." And again, a very strange quote by Levinas, "it's only in approaching the other that," I quote, "I seek my final reality." By the way, I think that's a very strange quote for Levinas. It reveals something that he would hate to have revealed about himself, which is a kind of underlying essentialism, which is very strange. In any case, I digress. What does this mean? It means that the proper response we should have to the responsibility we bear one another, the responsibility which Levinas claims we discover in our intimidation before one another, is to commit ourselves fully to the service of the other. It's to recognize that if we are to live our lives fully and honestly, we must dedicate ourselves completely to the fundamental reality that our being does not belong to ourselves, but belongs finally and wholly to the other. I quote, "The relationship with the other puts me into question, and in doing so empties me of myself, empties me without end, showing me ever new resources from which I can draw." You are never finished in your responsibility. You can never do enough. Yeah? You are always plagued by the sense of guilt and responsibility and shame that you could have done more. Yeah? I could have done more. Of course, the classic example of this is in Spielberg's Schindler's List, at the end where Schindler says, this watch. Do you know how many lives I could have saved with this watch? Yeah? I mean, this from a man who clearly did his duty. Yeah? The best way we can deal with the anxiety, then, that we have here and now, see, I'd like to make it practical, of presenting our work to one another this weekend, we could thus conclude with Levinas, would be to give ourselves over to that anxiety entirely. To recognize that every moment of your time here, and not only here, but even once you go home, should be dedicated fully to the service of the other. So don't sleep tonight. Don't give in to the temptation to cut yourself off from your responsibility, and thereby from the true center of your being. Yeah? Don't go out and have a drink or a cigarette, fleeing into these pleasures. Yeah? Coiling inwards on your own enjoyment, away from this responsibility. Yeah? Don't give in to that temptation. Instead, stay awake. Stay up all night, revising, resubmitting your manuscript, rewriting, so that you don't let your neighbor down, so you don't let me down. There's always more you could be doing. You can see why my students love me. You can never get an A. Reject the temptation to enjoy yourself here, or to relax into that casual conversation. To do so would be to forget your primordial obligation to one another, and to fall back into what he calls the myth of self-sufficiency. The myth of self-sufficiency, as we saw purported in Heidegger. A self-sufficiency which we saw gives way to the fascism of self-service and self-satisfaction. Stay watchful. Stay vigilant in your anxiety and intimidation, and in your social shame before one another. Only thusly will you be able to remain awake to the fact that your being is not your own, but in fact belongs to your neighbor. And only thusly will you be able to stay awake to what Levinas calls your, and I quote, infinite and irrevocable responsibility to that neighbor. Of course, I think you see the problem here too. For if we take Levinas' claims concerning the fundamentally public nature of the self in relation to society, and to their logical conclusion, that is, if we acknowledge with him the self's inextricable responsibility to the other, then we seem to lose any right to privacy and self-determination. We lose ourselves in the public, obliterating the private. You can see why, at the beginning, I said, it seems to me that there's a series of wrong turns here, that we tend to absolutize one to the obliteration of the other. And in this state of giving ourselves over entirely to the other, I mean, a simple question. What's to protect us from being crushed and overwhelmed by the demands of the other? What's to prevent us from being destroyed by his or her solicitations and the burdens with which the presence of the other places upon us? Doesn't this, and by the way, this is a word Levinas himself uses, doesn't this obsession, that's his word, doesn't this obsession with our duty to the other ultimately stultify us? Make us incapable of ever acting? Isn't there some sense in which this kind of infinite responsibility persecutes you to the point of possible destruction? By the way, persecute, that's Levinas' word. We are persecuted by the other. This, again, from a man who was in a POW internment camp. I mean, so he's not playing with, he's not mincing words here. This is not, mere ivory tower reflection here. My question, what's to prevent us from losing ourselves entirely in the responsibility we have to the other? Levinas insists that I find myself in the other, but I fear that. It seems like I can easily lose myself. What's to prevent me from emptying myself to the point of absolute exhaustion and ultimately extinction and death? And indeed, I think that's what Levinas thinks you should be, persecuted to the point of the death of the self. Yeah. In fact, he says it's only in your death that you will be, released. It's very strange. And here's my question. Isn't it something like this which gives way to cultish obsequience? More poignantly, isn't it this kind of demand for an absolute service, a responsibility from which one can never escape and from which one can never rest, something which leads directly to the kind of madness we see in suicide bombings, totalitarian states, and the kind of mass suicides of the Jonestown Massacre, right? I mean, if the man says, drink the Kool-Aid, drink the Kool-Aid. My will is not my own. It is entirely given over to the will of the other, right? Do we see that? So it is that we find ourselves nearing the end of this reflection on the question of social responsibility, caught between the twin pincers of Heidegger's fundamental ontological privacy and Levinas' inescapable, infinite public responsibility. Either, it seems, we cast our lot in with Heidegger, and in doing so, risk falling into the fascism of self-service and self-satisfaction, or we give ourselves over to Levinas' account and thereby risk collapsing into a dictatorship of the public. But, as I'm sure you've all already guessed, you're very smart, given the title of this talk and what I said in the introduction, I don't think those are the only two options. I think there's another way. A way which allows us to acknowledge and affirm the power of these two accounts without being crushed by the extremes to which they respectively seem to run. This third option, or middle way, and I kind of play around there a bit, those of you with a religious background might see it, I think we find in Foucault's concept of resistance and self-disciplinary care. So, my last person, and this is no longer a straw man, this is my first real person. Or something resembling it. Foucault begins his account of the nature of the self by acknowledging with Levinas, though not explicitly, that the self emerges through the play of a field of forces and powers which exceed it. A field of forces at work in the discourse of others. He's drawing extensively from Lacan here. The self must be considered, thinks Foucault in other words, a fundamentally social project. That's his term. For it is the product of what he terms the exercise of power, knowledge, and discipline by others. The self is thus for Foucault, as it is for Levinas, fundamentally a social construct and an inexplicably publicly traded commodity. You are the discourse of the others. You are what they say. But what Foucault seems to recognize, that as we've seen, Levinas does not, is that this genesis of the self, this origin of the self, conditions the emergence of what we've seen is a kind of totalitarianism of the other, or what Foucault terms a state of domination. A state in which the subject is completely overwhelmed and overdetermined by the other, stripped thereby of any privacy. In this state, thinks Foucault, the self is subject to manipulation and control, and all too easily mistreated and ultimately destroyed. By the way, those of you who flew here experienced a wonderful example of this sort of public exposure of the self. You go through the little scanner, and all of your privacy is immediately stripped in this disciplinary power knowledge. We have to know whether you're carrying anything here. And it's a way of disciplining you. Stand in line, do this, do that. Yeah? It just robs you of any privacy. In this state of domination, the self is subject to manipulation and control and all too easily mistreated and ultimately destroyed. This possibility, therefore, demands, he argues, that the self develop some private freedom, that the self carve out some space for itself from within this field of forces levied by the power knowledge of the other. We accomplish this task, Foucault suggests, by learning to, and here's his term, resist the immediate exigency of the demands placed upon us by the other. Now, this is interesting. And I want to talk a bit about this concept of resistance. Echoing the call to authenticity issued in Heidegger, and he makes that explicit, Foucault argues that it is only by learning to attend equally to one's own self as to the solicitation of the other, that is, it is only by learning to, and this is his term for it, care for oneself, that the subject can learn to live within the dynamic tension of its own being. And learning to care for ourselves, Foucault argues, we learn to exercise a kind of counterpower over the self, a kind of counter-discipline, a discipline and power which rivals the disciplinary knowledge power of the other. This, he of course famously explores through the Greek idea of ascesis, or self-control, right? You're disciplining the self as opposed to giving it over to the discipline of others. But bear in mind, you don't discipline the self to the point of absolute control, right? The whole concept of resistance, if you'll allow me a Heraclitean metaphor here, is that there has to be a tension being pulled on both sides. You draw the restraint, yeah? And in doing so, you open up a space within which subjectivity can live. Does that metaphor make sense? So, it's not an entirely rejecting the claim of the other, yeah? Nor is it entirely in rejecting the demands of the self. It's in exercising a resistance in both directions. So note that the freedom pursued in self-care is not for Foucault absolute. It's impossible, he thinks, to free oneself of the other. There is, and I quote, no true self, according to Foucault, as there is for Heidegger. There is no final being, as we saw Levinas say, that I can liberate myself to by resisting domination. The freedom we pursue in resisting the tendency towards the state of domination is a freedom which is always bound and circumscribed by the conditional limits placed upon it by the other. Care for the self as a form of ascesis and self-discipline merely provides a counterbalance to the discipline exercised by the other in power knowledge. Resistance and self-care function to place a kind of check on the otherwise rampant power of the other, right? It places a paros, a limit. Yeah, it defines the self by setting limits on the discourse of the other. right? But at the same time, you have to resist the tendency to infinitize the self, yeah? You have to place a check on that. But of course, that check's already naturally there through the discourse of the others, right? So again, you exercise a biconditional, I feel like I'm teaching logic, a biconditional material equivalence, a biconditional self-discipline. All right? Where was it? It ensures, so discipline and self-care ensures that we are not overwhelmed or destroyed by the other. It holds back the tendency towards totalitarian domination. The freedom we pursue, then, through resistance to the other. So this is a very strange idea of social responsibility. Resist the other. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. The freedom we claim in self-care is thus for Foucault a kind of dialectical freedom, one which must perpetually measure itself against the demands of the other. The other's demands function as a kind of framework within which we learn to define ourselves through self-discipline and self-care. In fact, he says the self must justify itself to the other. And I think it does this in fearless speech. That's precisely what it does. It justifies itself. This is why I was tempted earlier, I don't remember, in your talk, right, to talk about reason. Because Foucault, he says, I'm totally a modern. He says he loves the project of Kant and reason. Because justification, and not reason in some sort of absolutized, free-floating sense. Foucault is very aware that reason is a historically, culturally embedded idea. But it provides the framework for how you justify yourself, right? So it gives you a framework by which you can resist that totalitarian thing. You can demand rational justification, yeah? And that's a lovely way of carving the subject. That's why the subject is always related to reason things. Very intriguing. Okay. But again, I get excited. It's a problem. What the other does, in other words, by soliciting us with his or her demands and expectations, what you do by looking at me, by making me nervous, is you open a field wherein I can determine myself by choosing how I will respond to you. In other words, your gaze does place a responsibility on me. But that ability to respond is precisely a freedom which I have to define myself. It doesn't mean I simply have to go around following your every will. Yeah? It invites me to justify your demands. It invites me to reflect on them and think through them for my own self. So we can only claim the freedom that the other invites us to through their gaze, through their responsibility, by first, and this is key, by first resisting the temptation to be completely subject to and overwhelmed by the other's desires. In other words, resistance is merely the first step. Yeah? Only by resisting this temptation to give ourselves over to the desires of the other, only by holding ourselves back from the absolute exigency of the other's power, can we carve out a space for our own being and create in this resistance a relative freedom, a freedom to deliberate and decide how we will comport ourselves with regards to the other. You see? So, resistance is not the final word. That's key. Social responsibility is the final word. But resistance to the other is the first step in claiming an authentic social responsibility. It's very strange. You see? It's like going backwards to move forward. So it is, thinks Foucault, that we must refuse to get swept along by the power of the other. We must resist the temptation to be completely determined by his or her discourse, his or her desire, his or her expectations. Only by insisting on a small space, for in which to deliberate and determine how we will respond to those demands. Only by requesting, demanding a moment to breathe, to think, to decide how we're going to respond. Only thusly can we truly rise to ourselves and properly attend to our own being. Yeah? You say, wait a minute. Let me think. Let me justify. Yeah? I need to deliberate. Now notice, this deliberation is still on behalf of the other. Yeah? You define yourself in that, but you have the freedom to know how you will respond. Yeah? Only thusly, he finally concludes, can we forge the right relationship between self and society. One which refuses the possibility of absolute self-service, qua Heidegger, but also resists the tendency towards a totalitarianism of the other, qua Levinas. Is that clear? Does that make sense? Okay. To conclude, and in order to suggest what this man part looked like, That is, because now you're sitting here going, all right, Dalton, thanks a bunch. You first acknowledged that I'm freaked out. You then told me I should ignore it. Then you told me I should give myself over to it fully. Then you told me there's a third way. Can you perhaps make this applicable so that I don't die of a panic attack in learning and trying to figure out what to do with my panic, right? Panicking about your panic. All right, so I think I can conclude and try to apply it by repeating an old story told by the Russian communist leader Vladimir Lenin, which apparently happened near the very start of the revolution. Now, as you may or may not know, the slogan of the Soviet school system under communism was a quote from Lenin that it was the duty of every student truly committed to the revolutionary cause to liberate the poor from their oppression to, quote, learn, learn, learn. Now, apparently the story goes, and again, if you want some documentation on this, Zizek talks about it in his book on violence. Apparently, the story goes that a young man, no older than yourselves, who was deeply moved by the suffering so apparent in Russia at the time, and overwhelmed by the exigency of the human need he saw on the streets every day, moved, in other words, by his profound sense of responsibility to the other, here Levinas, approached Lenin and asked Lenin how best he could serve the revolution, how best, in other words, he could devote himself to his social responsibility. Apparently, as you've of course already guessed, Lenin responded to this young man by suggesting that he learn. Good, thank you. That's less dramatic than I expected. That he should, in other words, pause and for a moment resist the exigency to do something now. What Lenin seems to be suggesting is that responsibility begins by first resisting absolute responsibility. It starts by carving a space and a time to develop the self through learning, in order to develop a framework to know how better to deliberate upon the needs and demands of the other, and respond to them more appropriately. Does that make any sense? Nevertheless, we must always remember that this self-care is not ultimately for our own sake, but for the other. It is but a moment in the revolutionary service to the liberation of the suffering of others. Thus, our resistance to the demands of the other does not dissolve into narcissistic self-service, the eternal student, but functions merely as a retrograde movement ultimately directed towards the other. Thus, through resistance to the other, we begin to find a way of being a self for the other. What this story reveals to me is something of the kind of balance which Foucault suggests we can forge through self-discipline and care for the self. It seems to me that we cannot cut ourselves entirely free from the demands of the other, as Heidegger seems to suggest we should. Nor can we give ourselves over fully to them, as Levinas suggests. We must learn to resist both the extreme of authenticity and the extreme of absolute responsibility. Instead, I think we must learn to discipline ourselves in order to carve a space wherein we can learn, deliberate, and forge an appropriate response to the other. Let me just give you an example about this for a moment. When the hungry other asks for food, we shouldn't shove food in its mouth at the loss of hearing that the other has specific kinds of demands, i.e., I'd like my food salted, or kosher, or halal. Yeah? We have to momentarily resist our sense of responsibility to pause and think, what is the duty I owe to the other, and how best can I respond? Yeah? Sometimes by rushing headlong into this, we do more damage than good. Yeah? This insistence upon a momentary pause in which to develop the self through ascesis for the sake of the other is, in my opinion, the most radical form of revolutionary act we can take. You're doing it now, by the way. Only by resisting both the potential fascism of the self, an absolutization of the self and my own self-interest, and the potential totalitarianism of the other, can true justice be pursued. Feel free here to read a kind of historical context in here between sort of a Nazi fascism and a Stalinist totalitarianism. I love it. Hopefully, these reflections on the relation of the self to society, the individual to the communal, the private to the public, have been fruitful to you. Hopefully, I have neither disappointed nor bored you. Hopefully, I have lived up to the sense of responsibility which you gave me, and the freedom you granted me in listening. But even more, I hope that you can take something from these reflections as you attempt to mediate your own sense of responsibility to your peers, and as you deal with your own natural anxieties which result from subjecting yourself to the disciplinary expectations of your audience at a conference of this sort. My best and final advice to you: resist, deliberate, learn, and respond.